In the early 1990s, in the provincial town of Borysoglebsk in the Voronezh region, an incident occurred that is still whispered about among the locals. 20-year-old surgeon Alexei took revenge on gangster Sergei Bury for raping his mother in the most brutal way possible. During a routine operation, he cut off his penis, then disappeared with his mother, leaving no trace. Burim, a man who had kept the entire city in fear, threw all his forces into the search but was unable to find them. This is a story about how a quiet, intelligent young man became a cold-blooded avenger, and about what happens when the law is silent and justice is taken into one's own hands. The year was 1993. Formally, the Soviet Union had not existed for 2 years. However, in Russia's provincial cities, the spirit of that time still held firm, a mixture of confusion, chaos, and fear of a new reality in which the old rules no longer worked, and the new ones had not yet been established. Borysoglebsk, a small town in the Voronezh region with a population of about 60,000, was a typical example of such a place. Factories stood idle, salaries had not been paid for months, and people survived as best they could, trading in markets, growing vegetables in their dachas, and taking out loans from acquaintances that they could not repay. In this vacuum of authority, organized criminal groups flourished. Local trade, markets, shops, and even private stalls were controlled by a group led by a man nicknamed Bury, Sergei, a 35-year-old former athlete and master of sports in boxing who served in the army in the 1980s. After his discharge, he worked as a security guard, then as a sports coach, and in the early 1990s, he gathered a group of similarly strong guys around him and began to build his criminal empire. Bury was short, 5'9", but broad-shouldered, muscular, with a square jaw, a crew cut, and cold gray eyes that showed no sympathy. He wore a black leather jacket, jeans, heavy boots, a gold chain around his neck, and rings on his fingers. His voice was low and calm, but when he spoke, everyone listened in silence. He was constantly followed by about 10 people. His crew, young guys aged 20 to 25, all athletic, all ready to carry out any order. He controlled practically the entire city. Every stall, every shop paid him tribute, from $50 to $300 a month, depending on the size of the business. Those who refused to pay received a warning, first with words, then with broken windows, then with beatings. Almost everyone paid. The police knew about Burr, but did nothing. Some of the officers had been bribed and received their share, while others were simply afraid, understanding that the system would not protect them if they went against the authority. This was the atmosphere in which Nina Alexeyevna, a 42-year-old Russian language and literature teacher at secondary school number 7, lived. She was a widow. Her husband had died 5 years ago of a heart attack. He had been an engineer at a local factory. He left her a 2-room apartment in a 5-story prefabricated building on the outskirts of the city, along with small savings, which quickly lost their value during the hyperinflation of the early 1990s. She lived on her teacher's salary, which was delayed by 3 to 4 months, and earned extra money by tutoring school children for exams at a nominal fee. Nina Alexeyevna was a calm, intelligent woman of medium height, slim, with dark hair that was beginning to turn gray, a kind face, and a soft voice. A respected teacher, she was loved by her students and appreciated by parents. She lived modestly and quietly, raising her son Alexei, her only child, who was the meaning of her life after her husband's death. Alexei, 20, was the complete opposite of the typical young man of that time. While his peers were trying to become gangsters or hustlers or simply survive on odd jobs, he was studying. He graduated from school with a gold medal, entered the Voronezh Medical Institute, and learned to become a surgeon. He was a quiet, serious, thin young man with dark hair and glasses, always holding books. He didn't drink, smoke, or get involved in crime, devoting all his time to his studies and helping his mother. After graduating from the institute in 1992, he was assigned to the Borysoglebsk District Hospital, worked as a surgeon, lived with his mother in the same apartment, gave her his entire salary, and was content with the minimum. Mother and son were very close. After his father's death, Alexei became not only Nina Alexeyevna's son, but also her support, friend, and confidant. They spent their evenings together, discussing books, medicine, and life. Nina was proud of her son, saw him as the continuation of the family's intellectual lineage, and hoped that he would be successful, perhaps move to a big city, and have a career. On the evening of 9th March 1993, around 8 p.m., someone rang the doorbell of Nina Alexeyevna's apartment. Alexei was not at home. He was on duty at the hospital, working the night shift, which he did twice a week. Nina opened the door without looking through the peephole, thinking it was a neighbor coming to borrow some salt or ask something. 3 men were standing on the doorstep. Sergei Bury was in the center, flanked by 2 of his men. Nina Alexeyevna did not recognize him, but she immediately sensed danger from their gaze, their posture, the way they entered the building without asking permission. Bury introduced himself and said he needed to talk to her about something important. Nina tried to close the door, saying that she had no one to talk to, that she was a teacher and knew nothing about the matters that might interest him. Bury pressed his foot against the door, preventing her from closing it, and said calmly but firmly that it would be better to let them in voluntarily. Otherwise, they would enter by force. Nina let them in, afraid of a scandal and of the neighbors hearing, calling the police, and causing problems. The 3 men entered the apartment and closed the door. Bury walked into the room, sat down on the sofa, and gestured for Nina to sit opposite him. His 2 men remained standing by the door, guarding the exit. Bury took some papers out of his jacket's inside pocket and put them on the table. He said that these were the documents for the apartment, that he needed the apartment for a particular matter, and that Nina had to sign a deed of gift, formally and voluntarily, transferring the condo to his acquaintance for a symbolic amount. In return, he promised to give her another place to live, a room in a dormitory or a small apartment on the outskirts, later, when it became available. Nina Alexeyevna was in shock. She didn't understand why he wanted her apartment, what the matter was, or why he had come to her specifically. She refused categorically, saying that she would not sign anything, that this was the only home she and her son had, that they would have nowhere else to live. Bury listened, nodded, and said that he understood her position, but that she had to understand his. If she did not sign voluntarily, other methods of persuasion would be used, not necessarily against her, perhaps against her son, who worked at the hospital and walked home in the evenings. Something could happen to him, an accident, an attack. The city had become dangerous. Nina turned pale, realizing this was a direct, unambiguous threat. She asked for time to think, saying she couldn't decide right now and needed to consult with her son. Bury looked at her for a long time, then said he would give her 3 days. If she didn't sign in for 3 days, there would be consequences. He stood up and headed for the door, but he stopped at the door, turned around, and looked at Nina again. Something else appeared in his eyes, not businesslike, but personal, predatory. He walked back slowly and told his people to go out into the hallway and wait there. They left and closed the room's door. Nina realized that something terrible was about to happen and tried to get up and run away, but Brown was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, pulled her toward him, and covered her mouth with his other hand to keep her from screaming. He pushed her onto the sofa and threw his weight on top of her. Nina tried to resist, scratching and writhing, but she didn't have enough strength. Bury was several times stronger, a trained boxer accustomed to violence. He raped her there, on the sofa, in her own apartment, brutally, quickly, without words. When he finished, he got up, straightened his clothes, looked at her lying there in tears, and said that it was a bonus, so that she would better understand the seriousness of the situation. That if she didn't sign the documents, it would be worse, perhaps not only for her, but also for her son. He left, slamming the door behind him. Nina lay on the sofa, unable to move, in a state of shock. She didn't know how much time had passed, maybe an hour, maybe less. Then she got up, went to the bathroom, washed herself for a long time with hot water, trying to wash away, to erase what had happened. She changed her clothes, lay down in bed, pulled the blanket over her head, and lay there staring at the ceiling, not crying, just staring into the void. When Alexei returned from his shift in the morning, around 8 o'clock, he found his mother in bed, pale, with a vacant look in her eyes. He asked what had happened and whether she was sick. Nina replied that she was just tired, hadn't slept well, and that it was nothing serious. Alexei believed her, thinking that it was just normal fatigue accumulated over years of a difficult life. He made her some tea, brought it to her in bed, and went to sleep himself. Over the next few days, Nina hardly left her room. She didn't go to work, but called in sick, saying she had a fever and the flu. She hardly ate anything and refused the food Alexei brought her. He became seriously worried and suggested calling a doctor. Nina refused, saying she would get better on her own and just needed time. A week later, when her condition had not improved, Alexei finally called a doctor to the house. A friend of theirs, a therapist from the same hospital, came, examined Nina, measured her blood pressure, and listened to her lungs and heart. Physically, everything was normal, but her psychological state was cause for concern. She recommended consulting a psychologist or psychiatrist, saying that it looked like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, similar to what happens after severe stress. Alexei asked his mother directly what had happened to traumatize her so much. Nina remained silent, looking away, tears streaming down her cheeks, but saying nothing. Alexei did not insist. He did not want to pressure her and decided to give her time, thinking that when she was ready, she would tell him herself. 2 weeks later, something happened that forced Nina to break her silence. On 10th April, a note was slipped into the apartment's mailbox, written in uneven handwriting on a sheet of school notebook paper. The text was short. The deadline had passed. The documents had not been signed. This was the last warning. If she did not show up at a specific address with the documents tomorrow, it would be too late. Her son would not live to see the following week. Nina read the note. Her hands trembled, her breathing quickened, and she began to panic. Alexei was at home, heard his mother breathing heavily, gasping for air, ran into the room, and saw her pale, with blue lips, gasping for air. He called an ambulance, which arrived quickly. The doctors gave her an injection, a sedative, and stopped the attack, but suggested she be hospitalized. Nina refused, saying she would stay at home and that her son, a doctor, would take care of her. When they were alone, Alexei took his mother's hands, looked her in the eyes, and said that he could no longer watch her suffer, that she had to tell him what had happened, what was threatening her, what the note was about. Nina looked at him for a long time, then cried, broke down, and began to tell him everything. She told him everything, about Burgo's visit, about the demand to sign the documents, about the rape, about the threats. She spoke quietly, pausing, ashamed, but she told him everything. Alexei listened, his face growing paler and paler, his hands clenching into fists, his jaws clenching. When her mother finished, he sat silently for a minute or two, then got up, left the room, and locked himself in his room. Nina heard him walking around, dropping something, banging his fist on the table. Then, silence. He came out half an hour later, his face calm and cold, his eyes hard. He told his mother that she shouldn't worry anymore, that he would sort things out and make sure Burry never bothered them again. Nina tried to stop him, saying that he shouldn't do anything, that it was dangerous, that Burry would kill him if he went against him. Alexei hugged his mother and said that he knew what he was doing, that she should trust him. Alexei Kovalev was not a violent man. He had never been in a fight in his life, avoided conflicts, and solved problems with words, or simply by walking away from the situation. But now words were powerless, and walking away was impossible. He understood that if he didn't stop Burry, he would continue, take the apartment, and maybe do something to his mother again, or to him. The police wouldn't help. Everyone knew that Burry was untouchable, protected, that testimony was pointless, that the case would not be opened or would be closed in a month due to lack of evidence. There was only one way left, to do himself what the law would not do. But how? Physically, he could not stand up to Brown, a former boxer surrounded by bodyguards. He did not know how to shoot, he had no weapon, and murder with a gun was the first thing the police would check for. They would find it and put him in jail. He needed a way that would leave no traces, that would look like an accident or a medical error, for which it would be difficult to hold anyone accountable in the chaos of the 90s, when medical errors were common due to a lack of equipment and medicines. Alexei began to observe Burry, learning his habits and the places he frequented. It turned out that Burry was not as invulnerable as he seemed. He had health problems that few people knew about. Varicose veins in the lower extremities, stage 3, are a disease common among people who stand a lot or have a genetic predisposition. Burry wore compression stockings under his pants, hiding the problem, but the pain was severe and made it difficult to walk, especially in the evening. Alexei found out about this by accident. He overheard a nurse in the hospital telling a colleague that a confident Sergei, surname such and such, age 35, was to be admitted to the surgical department for routine varicose vein removal, referred by a vascular surgeon from Voronezh. Alexei checked the records and found the patient's file. Sergei Burov, his real surname given to him by his parents, but in criminal circles, he was known only by his nickname. The operation was scheduled for 25th of April, 2 weeks later. It was a standard procedure, phlebectomy, removal of the affected veins through small incisions, under local anesthesia or light sedation, lasting 1 to 2 hours, with recovery taking several days. The department's chief surgeon, an experienced doctor, was to operate, but Alexei, his assistant, would be in the operating room to help. Alexei had a plan. It was terrible, cruel, but in his mind, it was fair. He wouldn't kill Burry. That would be too easy for him, too quick. He would make sure that Burry suffered as much as his mother had suffered, humiliation for humiliation, injury for violence. And he would do it in a way that would make it impossible to prove malicious intent, so it would appear to be a medical error or a decision made at a critical moment during the operation. Alexei spent 2 weeks preparing himself psychologically. He rehearsed in his mind how he would act, what he would say if asked. He studied the legal aspects of medical errors and read articles and case studies. He understood that if he did everything right, the worst he would face was dismissal and loss of his license, but not prison or criminal charges, because it is tough to prove intent in a medical error. On the morning of 25 April 1993, Sergei Burov arrived at the hospital. He arrived in a black Volga with 2 bodyguards who remained in the car at the entrance. He went to the reception, filled out the paperwork, was taken to a room in the surgical ward, given hospital pajamas, and told that the operation would be after lunch, that he should not eat or drink anything in the morning, and that an anesthesiologist would come before the operation to explain the procedure. Burry was calm, even relaxed. It was a routine operation with minimal risks. Thousands of such operations are performed every year, and complications are rare. He thought that in a week he would be discharged, return to work, and forget about the pain in his legs that had tormented him for the last 2 years. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. The operating room was standard. White walls, bright lights, a table in the center, instruments on tables around it, anesthesia, and vital signs monitoring equipment. The surgical team consisted of the chief surgeon, Alexei, as an assistant, an anesthesiologist, and a surgical nurse. Barry was laid on the operating table. The anesthesiologist put in an IV, administered a sedative and local anesthetic to the area of the operation, and numbed the leg where the veins would be removed. Burio felt his consciousness clouding over, sinking into a semi-sleep, hearing the doctor's voices but unable to make out the words, unable to move, his body not responding. The chief surgeon began the operation. He made incisions in the leg, began isolating the affected veins, clamping them, and removing them. Alexei assisted, handed instruments, monitored bleeding, and applied pressure. The operation proceeded as usual, without complications. About an hour passed when the central part was completed. The veins were removed, and all that remained was to suture the incisions. And then Alexei said that he had noticed something that needed to be checked. He pointed to the groin area and said that he saw signs of an inguinal hernia, a slight bulge that could become a problem in the future. Since the patient was already on the table under anesthesia, they could check it out. It would be worth suturing the hernia right away to avoid a repeat operation. The chief surgeon looked, saw no obvious signs, but Alexei insisted, saying that he had seen something similar before and that it was better to be safe than sorry. The chief surgeon agreed and noted Alexei could check while he sutured the leg incisions. Alexei made a small incision in the groin area, slightly higher than necessary to check for a hernia. His hands were steady, his movements confident. Years of training and hundreds of surgeries, both observed and performed under supervision, had given him a skill that he now used not for salvation, but for revenge. He cut through the tissue, reached the cavernous bodies of the penis and the arteries that supply it with blood. And he did what he had decided to do 2 weeks ago. He squeezed and cut the blood vessels that feed the penis with one precise, irreversible movement. The bleeding was instantaneous, but controllable. Alexei quickly applied clamps to stop the blood, but the damage was critical. Deprived of blood supply, the penis began to turn pale, the tissue began to die, and necrosis developed rapidly. 10 minutes later, it became clear that the organ was not viable. It started to turn black, and the smell of necrosis became apparent. Alexei turned to the chief surgeon, showed him what had happened, and said that during the incision, he had accidentally damaged the arteries, that the blood supply was critically impaired, that the tissue was dying, and that the only way out was amputation to prevent sepsis, which would develop if the necrotic tissue was left in place. The chief surgeon was shocked. In 30 years of practice, he had never seen such a thing, that during a simple operation to remove veins in the leg, the arteries of the penis were accidentally damaged. But the fact was, before his eyes, necrosis, blackening tissue, the smell. There was no time to waste. Sepsis could develop within hours and lead to death. The decision was made to amputate and save the patient's life, even at such a cost. Alexei performed the amputation. He cut off the penis at the base, carefully and professionally, sutured the stump, stopped the bleeding, and treated it with antiseptics. The whole process took 20 minutes. Bori was sedated the entire time, feeling nothing, unaware of what was happening. When the operation was over, Bori was transferred to the intensive care unit and began to come out of anesthesia. He woke up an hour later, still in a daze, not immediately understanding where he was. He felt pain in his leg where the veins had been removed, but that was to be expected. Then he began to feel a strange sensation, a lack of something, an emptiness in his groin area. He tried to move his legs, to feel his body. His hand instinctively reached down, thought through the sheet. Nothing. A flat surface, bandages, but nothing that should have been there. Panic seized me instantly. I started screaming, calling for the nurse, the doctor, demanding an explanation. The nurse came running, tried to calm me down, and said that the doctor would come soon and explain. A few minutes later, the chief surgeon arrived, his face grim and guilty. He explained that there had been a complication during the operation, unforeseen damage to the arteries, that necrosis had developed, that amputation was necessary to save his life, and that there was no other option. Barry listened, not believing, not understanding. How was this possible? He came in to have veins removed from his leg and woke up without a penis. How could this have happened? He demanded to see precisely what had been damaged, how it had happened, and who was to blame. The chief surgeon explained in medical terms, talking about an accidental incision, damage to blood vessels, rapid necrosis, and the impossibility of restoring the blood supply. He said that this happens, albeit rarely, and that it is a complication for which doctors are not technically criminally liable if they act in accordance with protocol to save a life. Barry realized that his life had changed forever. The man who had kept the city in fear, who was proud of his strength and masculinity, woke up castrated, incomplete. The humiliation was complete, absolute. And worst of all, he couldn't even take revenge, didn't know who was to blame, whether it was really an accident or someone's deliberate act. The chief surgeon looked genuinely upset, while his assistant, a young doctor with glasses whom Barry didn't even remember, having paid no attention to him during the operation, stood aside, silent and impassive. 3 days after the operation, on 28th April, Alexei and Nina disappeared from Borysoglebsk. The apartment was closed, some of their belongings had been taken away, and neighbors said they saw them leaving with suitcases early in the morning and getting into a taxi. No one knew where they had gone. Barry, still lying in the hospital, learned of their disappearance through his people. He immediately realized that this was no coincidence. The woman he had raped a month ago, from whom he had demanded an apartment, and the surgeon who had assisted in the operation, were mother and son. He realized that his castration was not an accident, but revenge, planned, cold, performed by the hands of a professional surgeon, so that there would be no evidence. Everything looked like a medical error. His rage was boundless. He threw all his energy into the search. His people combed the city and the surrounding areas, questioned everyone who might have seen Alexei or Nina, checked train stations, bus stations, and the airport in Voronezh. He called in his connections in the police, who searched databases, checked registrations, tickets, and travel records. Nothing. Alexei and Nina had vanished as if they had never existed. A week later, Barry was discharged from the hospital and returned to business. But everything had changed. His authority had been undermined. Rumors of his injury had spread throughout the city, and other groups had begun to raise their heads and challenge his territory. In the criminal world, weakness is not forgiven, and a castrated authority is no authority at all. He was laughed at, and his respect evaporated in a matter of weeks. He tried to maintain his position through force and cruelty, but it didn't help. The gang was falling apart, and people were leaving for competitors. 6 months later, Barry left Borysoglebsk and moved to another city, rumored to be Moscow, where no one knew him and where he could start from scratch, but no longer as an authority figure, but as an ordinary person, disabled and broken. He continued searching for Alexei and Nina for several more years, hiring private detectives, placing advertisements, and offering rewards for information, to no avail. No one knows for sure what happened to Alexei and Nina. There are theories that they went to Siberia, changed their names, and live quietly there, with Alexei working in some remote hospital under a different name, and Nina retired. Others say that they went abroad, to Germany or Israel, where Nina had distant relatives, settled there, and live an everyday life. Still others believe that they were found and killed, but their bodies were never found, and were buried somewhere in the forest. But none of these theories has been confirmed. Neither Alexei nor Nina ever reappeared in Borysoglebsk, never contacted their former acquaintances, and left no trace. It was as if they had disappeared from the face of the earth on that April day in 1993, when everything changed. According to the latest data, Sergei Burov died in 2010 in Moscow at the age of 52 from cirrhosis of the liver. He had been drinking heavily in recent years and lived alone, without a family or children, which he could not have after that operation. He was buried in Vagankovo Cemetery, with a simple cross on his grave, no identifying marks of his criminal past. The chief surgeon who operated retired in 1998 and died in 2005 of a heart attack. Until the end of his life, he considered that operation to be the most tragic mistake of his career, blaming himself for not noticing, not preventing it. However, objectively, he could not have done anything, as he had acted according to protocol. This story became a warning and a lesson. A warning to those who consider themselves untouchable, who think that power and connections will protect them from any revenge. A lesson to those who believe in justice, which sometimes comes not from the law, but from the hands of those who have been pushed to the edge, who have lost everything except the desire to punish their offender.